So welcome back everyone to DUPS discussions. Today we're speaking with Nick Hopkins, and as always, make sure to check out our social media. We do put up a post the day before asking you to ask any questions, and then we also post these interviews on the Blackboard page under DUPS. So the first question, I guess, is what is your main research area and what projects are you working on currently?
Okay, so I'm a social psychologist, so I'm interested very much in how our sense of who we are is bound up with the groups that we're members of how those groups shape our understandings of how we relate with other people, the things that become important to us. And that's always been a big interest that I've had. In terms of projects that I'm working on right now, I'm part of a group in Europe, in Hungary, the Netherlands, France, Germany, Serbia, and we're looking at the experiences of minorities, particularly their experiences of marginalization or discrimination. And obviously COVID has made that project harder, but it's also made that project quite interesting in that we're trying to look at the experience of various minorities across Europe of how COVID impacts upon their lives, the degree to which there is recognition, wider societal recognition of that community's difficulties in the period of COVID. So that's kind of an interesting project, looking very much at the experience of minorities.
That sounds really interesting. Has your project shifted a lot with COVID? Has it like become more focused on that almost, or is it still just in general how marginalized groups?
It shifted a fair bit, yeah. So it was a 2-year project. It comes to the end next year, early next year. And so COVID pretty well happened a year into the project. So we had done some interviews and we planned to do something called walking interviews, where you walk with your participant around the city and you get a feel for where they feel safe, where they feel less safe, areas that they'd avoid, areas that are important to them. And that allows a conversation about how do you think other people look at you and your group. To what degree do you feel that they really understand you and your group? Are there prejudiced assumptions about you? So we were hoping to do that sort of research in the field. It's a bit more interesting, I think, than just always doing things with a questionnaire or with a face-to-face interview. That obviously had to stop. So we shifted to doing online interviews, and inevitably the focus shifted to COVID, because we're looking at minority groups and their experiences within a wider society and their relationships with authority. And of course, COVID brings all of those things into sharp focus. So some minority groups are particularly badly affected by COVID, and they're also rather neglected by the wider society. So to some degree, COVID allowed us to shift a focus, but also to look at a particular feature of how a minority group can feel ignored or overlooked. So it's been interesting, but for sure it's been a challenge.
I guess in some ways COVID kind of increased or made it more prevalent, the issues that they might have had before, even like with authority and different things.
Yeah, to some degree. I certainly think there is a sense of that. Sometimes people, however, would say that they felt that it made their position slightly better. For example, people would say, now people aren't really so interested in how I look. They're much more focused on their own health and well-being, and people aren't going around staring at me or shouting things at me anymore. They're much more focused on their own health and well-being. So some people said that things they thought were slightly easier. People also spoke a little bit about how, when there was the period when people were clapping for the NHS, that gave them an opportunity to participate in the sort of activities within their neighbourhood. And there was a little bit of social connection with their neighbours that perhaps otherwise they wouldn't have had. And they felt that that allowed them a bit of an opportunity to integrate a little bit more, that they perhaps be accepted and seen by their neighbours as being part of the community. So it's a mixed story. So we've got a lot of interview material to try to plough through.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting, and it'll be really interesting to hear what happens after. I mean, if COVID ever ends, but if a vaccine gets distributed and, it kind of goes back to what it was before, it'll be interesting to see if those effects stay around.
Yeah, at one level, COVID is a massive social experiment. Not one that you want to go through as a participant very often. And of course, it is pretty devastating for many, many people.
Yeah, it's definitely not a voluntary participation.
No.
How did you get, you said that you were you've always been quite interested in group memberships and like group identity. How did you start off your career, or did you start off studying being like, I want to become a social psychologist, or did it kind of merge into that position?
It was all one big accident. In that, I did a first degree in psychology. It was called experimental psychology. And I didn't really know what psychology entailed, and I was quite surprised when I discovered quite what it did entail. I thought it would all be about personality and Freud and things like this. So it was a bit of a shock to discover, oh, it's not really like that. I enjoyed studying social psychology, but then after I did my first degree, I traveled for a little bit. I met my wife, and very quickly we had a child. And so I did a master's course in criminology, and this was a bit of a change. And what I really liked about it was a mixture of psychology, psychiatry, law, philosophy, and sociology. And I just loved the sociology, and that really for me was an eye-opener. And I thought, fantastic, I'd love to study this. And then that course finished, and that was all fine. We then had a period of unemployment where we lived with my parents, myself, my wife, and our son. That's quite sort of complicated, just, a bit of a crowded house. So then I thought, oh, I'd like to do a PhD. And I applied to do sociology PhDs, and they said, yeah, absolutely no problem, in a few places, but there was no funding. And then, this is the accident, my wife saw an advert. In the old days, this is going way back to 1983, 1984, on a Tuesday, The Guardian used to advertise posts in education. So we always used to buy The Guardian on a Tuesday, and she read it in very close detail and saw that there was an advert for a PhD at the University of Exeter in social psychology. And I thought, well, it's close enough to sociology. I'll try. So I went for the interview, and I got the position. So it wasn't really my first choice, to be honest, but then I rapidly realized that social psychology is broad enough. You can do a whole variety of things in social psychology. My PhD was all experimental, but after doing that PhD, I then worked for 2 years on a project looking at young people and the police. And that allowed me to do some interviews and a little bit of observational work. And that then made me realize and think, oh, actually, social psychology is broad enough for me to be able to do a whole variety of things. And I've stuck with that ever since.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing more and more from these interviews is that it doesn't always, it's rare that it kind of becomes like, I want to do this, and then you go on to do exactly that. There's kind of a lot more experiences and I guess almost like failures and changes that happen
Exactly.
that, make you, fit that position, I guess you could say, or make it make more sense. One thing I thought is really interesting about you and your work is that a lot of it is abroad. You've done a lot of work in India, I think it was, and there's and now you're doing it all over Europe as well. And you said that you traveled as well. How do you think that influenced not only you as like a person individually, but also your work just in general?
Well, that's a good question. I must confess, I've always liked traveling. And I suppose the nice thing with being a social psychologist is that you can be nosy and you can justify being nosy. So I've done a lot of work in the UK interviewing people, their lives and their experiences or their ideas. And I just find that an amazing privilege. I mean, it sounds a bit pious and a bit highfalutin, but there is something just very nice when you can talk with people and learn about their lives. So I really like that. And the attraction, obviously, with travel, as if you can, as a tourist, you get a glimpse of other people's lives. That's fascinating. But if you can do research in a location, that really gives you an opportunity to get to see things that perhaps you wouldn't see as a tourist. So there is something for me very, very attractive about being able to talk with people, having interviews, getting a glimpse of a different way of being, different way of life. And then, of course, you can do that to an even greater degree if you do research overseas. So you mentioned a project in India, and that for me, again, was a complete accident. I've never planned anything. And I don't know if that's a fault or just the way things are in general. I went to India in 2003. I didn't know anybody there. I had a sabbatical, which meant I had a semester off from teaching. And many people would say, oh, I'll go to America. That's where there's a lot of social psychology going on. But I thought, well, why go to America when to some degree social psychology is so shaped by American authors and research that you kind of already know it. You're not going to learn that much. Whereas if you go somewhere like India, it's going to be a very, very different experience. So I went on my own to Benares Hindu University, and I was there for 9 weeks. And when I arrived, I thought, God, I've made an enormous mistake. It was quite a sort of, the arrangements there were quite basic in all sorts of ways. But very quickly, I just thought, oh, this is fantastic. And I just really enjoyed meandering around, getting to meet people, talking with people. And at some stage, I was feeling a bit guilty, thinking, oh, I should be writing papers or I should be doing something, very serious. But actually, it was the most useful time that I think I've ever spent because I met people and became friends with them. And then we discussed potential research projects. And one idea emerged, and that was to look at this massive pilgrimage site. And it's been studied perhaps by historians, or it may be studied by people from religious studies. But social psychology hasn't looked at a mass gathering that attracts millions of pilgrims to the banks of the Ganga. So I thought this would be just a wonderful opportunity. And then we managed to get funding for that. And again, just to have a glimpse of other people's lives that in many ways I still don't understand because the belief system is still quite alien to me. But just to have a glimpse of the routines that people go through, the significance of this collective event, of how, that sense of being part of a group going through these rituals on the banks of the Ganga, and they live there in very basic conditions for a month. You don't see that as a tourist, and it's an immense opportunity and privilege to be able to be nosy and ask people, what does this mean and why do you do that? Of course, I couldn't ask directly. We had translators. So it was a wonderful experience that I really enjoyed. And I've still got contacts in India that I keep in contact with.
I guess I definitely agree. I mean, it's a huge privilege being able for people to let someone into their lives almost and like get a glimpse of what their everyday life is like. When in a sense they don't have any obligation to tell you, I guess you would say. I was wondering, this is just because I'm quite interested in research as well. For a project like that, how do you get funding, or how do you how does that process kind of happen?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. It's a tough process. We were kind of lucky. And again, it was a series of accidents. As I said, when I was there, I met this guy, we had a nice conversation. And then when I came back to the UK, I was just struck by the relatively poor infrastructure that they were working with. So their library facilities were remarkably poor. They didn't have access, this is in 2003, didn't have access to the sort of international journals that we take for granted. So I suggested, and we ran this, we had funding from the British Council, £5,000, I think it was, to do a 3-week summer school where we took about 30 PhD students in India and some junior faculty, and we had a program taught by academics from the UK, but also taught by academics from India in the area of social psychology, theory and research. And it didn't really work very well, to be honest, because it was all in the classroom and we were talking about research in a very abstract sense. So then the second time we did it, again with funding from the British Council, we said, let's do the same sort of thing, except let's have a research project where it makes it much more concrete, where we take a particular issue and then we think, how could we research it? What theories are relevant? What research practice? And we decided to do it on this pilgrimage event that takes place in Allahabad. That was much more fun, much more productive. The year after that, we managed to get some more funding to do something rather similar. So gradually, we put together a sense of, well, actually, we could do some interesting research around this. And then we put in a much larger bid for £500,000 to the UK main social science funder, the Economic and Social Research Council. And they gave us funding that allowed us to employ 4 postdoctoral researchers in India and 1 in Dundee. And that was then a 3-year project that we were able to conduct the research. We were so lucky in that we had these small mini projects that had developed initially as a teaching exercise, and then it became a bit more of a let's do the research properly sort of focus. And that then meant that we could go to the ESRC and say, look, we have a track record of doing this research. We know it can be done. It's feasible. We have the contacts in India. It's a fascinating research site. Here's the proposal. And we were very lucky to get the money. But getting research funds these days is very, very competitive.
I mean, that makes sense because you kind of prove to them almost that it's definitely possible and you can get a lot out of it.
Yeah, so
that
it
makes
was
a lot.
connected, but it was a series of accidents. So at the outset, when I went to India in 2003, I had no idea that this would be the beginning of 10 years, essentially, of working around that particular thing. And as I said, when I went there, I kind of did think, oh, I've made a big mistake. I should be writing papers. When I go back to Dundee and they say, what have you done with your sabbatical? They'll shoot me. But during that time, I was able to travel quite a lot. I met a lot of people, and it really gave me a sense of opportunity that otherwise I wouldn't have had. So one of the things I regret about academic life now is that the opportunity for having those moments, I think, are less, because it's a bit of a treadmill. The opportunities to have a sabbatical is now a concept. You kind of think, oh, what is that? We've forgotten about what it's like.
It's funny that you say that because I'm from Denmark, as I mentioned before we started. And in Denmark, it's very common practice to take a sabbatical, like to take a year out before you start any kind of degree or anything. It's almost, I mean, I went straight into university and a lot of my friends thought it was really strange that I didn't take a gap year or a year out because it's so common here. So do you think, for example, I know 4th year students and 3rd year students are probably thinking about it as well for applying, to masters and postgraduate studies, etc. Do you think it would be beneficial for a lot of people if they took a year out? Or do you think, I mean, of course, it depends on the individual, but do you think you can gain a lot from doing that? Or do you think that it would be almost better to do it after you finish, for example, postgraduate studies? What are your thoughts on that?
I think taking a year out's a good thing to do in general. I think travel is a good thing to do. Of course, COVID is changes all of that massively. I was very, very lucky. I did my first degree and then I went traveling and I worked. I went to Israel and worked on a kibbutz, which is like a collective farm. They still exist, but their kind of ethos has changed quite a lot. That was where I ended up meeting my wife. She came back with me. So within a year, I traveled a bit, met my wife, then came back to the UK. And it was just kind of a useful period to have because you kind of think, what do I want to do next? And I guess there's a danger that education is reduced to being a set of hurdles that you kind of rush through and you get all the certificates and then life starts. So I think it's nice to be able to take a bit of a step outside and to think what you want to do. When I graduated, I had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do. And then while I was away traveling, I thought, oh, criminology sounds interesting. And I actually applied. I can remember applying while I was traveling, trying to get the little photograph you had to submit with your application, things like that. In the old days, it was all done by post, of course. So I think it's good to get out and just have a little bit of a breather, think what it's all about. I do think that university degrees now, there's so many hurdles. When I did my first degree, we had exams after the first year, no exams in the second year. And then your degree was based upon 8 exams at the very end of your third year. So you could slow down, you could be a bit lazy. Sometimes I was, sometimes I wasn't. You could be, it wasn't a constant treadmill. Whereas now I think the undergraduate degree is a bit of a constant treadmill. And sometimes you need to step off the treadmill for a while to clear your head, I think. So I think having a year out is a good thing. My own son, he had 2 years out. So at some stage we wondered, was he ever going to come back? Because he was traveling a lot and really enjoying things. But I think he would also say that it was a fantastic, taking a year out isn't easy, because quite often you find if you travel, you find yourself somewhere where you don't want to be, where you're feeling a bit lousy, you're feeling a bit homesick. And I guess the good thing with that is you know that there's no way of just getting home straight away. You just have to go to bed knowing, well, tomorrow's another day and it'll be better tomorrow. So I think there's a good thing to get used to through.
It builds a lot of character, I guess, because you're kind of forced to develop yourself.
Yeah, you just get on with it. Yeah.
I
So
think
I
also, because it also seems like from a lot of what's it called? First, I know a lot of people are interested in clinical psychology, and a lot of the academic talks we've had, etc., this year have been very focused on experience. They want a lot of experience, and I guess it makes sense because you don't want academia to kind of become this very like set of rules where everyone just did the same thing and end up the same place. I feel like the experiences and the different the different things people experience kind of shape the field, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Not sure if that makes sense, but like whatever you experience and whatever you kind of what kind of work you do kind of shapes where you go in the field, but it also shapes the way you are in the field, like how you deal with different situations, how you approach things, just in general.
Yeah, I agree. I think getting a whole set of experiences, it starts to make you rethink what you want to do. You start to question things. As I said, I think it's a bit sad when education becomes reduced to a set of hurdles that you have to kind of skip over. And actually getting out, doing things, having a variety of experiences, I think it's a really important thing. And I think you're absolutely right in terms of psychology as a discipline. You know, we're studying human beings and we're trying to understand human behavior. To have, you know, psychologists who all have the same background, who all have the same experiences, who all are looking at the world through one set of glasses is going to be deeply problematic. So I think for the discipline as a whole, it benefits from having diverse people with diverse experiences. So trying to have those diverse experiences within the discipline is a great thing to have for the discipline. And I think it's also personally enriching. And of course, you learn from your mistakes. Not all experiences are great. So, you know, you can travel and have a grim time, but you still take away something from it. It could be just the sense that, okay, it was grim, but I survived. That's good. Didn't kill me, made me stronger. That's the sort of thing. And it could be that you realise, I thought I'd like this, but I realise now, actually, I don't like it at all.
There was one question from our Instagram. Someone asked what your thoughts are on becoming a successful psychologist.
Blimey. Successful psychologist, I don't know. I guess it all depends on what you mean by success. Success in the academic world is something that I think it can be quite painful because we're under pressure to publish. We're under pressure to bring in research grants, and kind of promotion and being successful is bound up very much with that, to be honest. They pay a little bit of attention to your teaching, but a lot of it is on essentially your CV. What are you publishing? Where are you publishing? Is it of high status? Is it going to add to the reputation of the university? So you sometimes have a sense that that is the only measure of success. And that I think is very, very sad. And I think I can think of people who work their socks off. And I kind of think, really, are you interested in the work, or is it simply that this is what you feel you ought to do to be publishing, getting a grant? I don't think I've done that in the sense I've been lucky. I think the environment now for academics and for being a successful psychologist probably are much different to 30 years ago when I started. It was a bit more flexibility. I've been lucky in that I've been able to do pretty well what I want to do without too much constraint. So as I said, I like doing qualitative work. I like doing interviews. I like trying to get into situations that otherwise I could never get into, and just to have a sense of what it's like here. So in that sense, I kind of feel that I've been successful in terms of doing things that I want to do. I've not been particularly successful in getting grant income, and I've not been particularly successful in getting lots of publications that mean that I'm a big name or anything like that. So I certainly wouldn't claim success in those areas. But in terms of being able to do something that I quite enjoyed, I kind of think, yeah, I've been able to do that. Not all the time, of course. You know, sometimes you have to do things that your heart isn't really in. It would be crazy not to do them. But most of the time, I've been pretty lucky, I think, in terms
I
of
guess
doing.
it's kind of quality over quantity, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and then of course there's the question of how do you define quality? So 30 years ago, I began doing some interview work, which I really enjoyed. It was young people and their interactions with the police. I really enjoyed it, and I thought I learned a lot from it. I also did interviews with the police. I really enjoyed that and thought a lot about it. I felt I learned a lot from it. But in that period, trying to publish in psychology journals qualitative work was incredibly hard. It was seen as kind of lesser value, it's kind of low status. If only you had some quantitative data, then your work would be much better. And of course, I always thought, well, that's a bit crazy. It depends on the question you want to ask. Some questions, yes, you need to have quantitative data. Some questions, you need to have qualitative data. So certainly then, it was quite hard to do some of the things that I wanted to do and still publish. And so my whole experience for a period, about 10 years, was one of quite frustrating, feeling I was doing something I quite liked and enjoyed and thought was useful, but then trying to get it published in journals was much harder because they weren't really very open to qualitative work. Things have changed quite a lot, so that does make life much easier. I don't know if that answers your question. I can't even remember what your question was.
I mean, it was someone wrote on our Instagram, so I just wanted,
Yeah.
I guess it was just about like what advice to become a successful psychologist. But I guess, I mean, the main takeaway from that, at least for me, is that you take kind of, sometimes it's hard, sometimes you don't really want to do it, but if you're kind of focused on what you actually enjoy doing, then I feel like that's the best way almost.
Yeah.
Because
I mean,
then you can
sometimes,
almost do anything. I mean, if you're interested in it, even if it becomes, annoying or stressful or hard, because you're so interested in it, it kind of gets you through it.
that's certainly true. I think that's certainly true. But at the same time, there are external pressures. And those pressures now are much, much harder. So, I'm 61. And if I kind of think now for young people starting in an academic role, the situation now is very, very different. The pressure to publish, the pressure to bring in grants is really very keenly felt. And, there are lots of surveys that show that academics are amongst those who are the most stressed because you constantly feel that you're not doing what you should be doing. You're constantly feeling you're not doing enough. So the atmosphere within universities now can be quite painful, I think, particularly for junior staff who are just starting out. Of course, I'm just talking about being an academic psychologist. So, of course, you can be many different sorts of psychologists. Many of our students want to go into clinical psychology, for example, or health psychology. That again, I think is, it's a pretty demanding field to get into. I guess in terms of being a successful clinical psychologist, that is not only a matter of getting a job, getting the training, getting the publications that go with that, but it's also about developing those therapeutic skills. And I guess if you can develop those therapeutic skills and see that you make a difference to people's lives through deploying them, that must be amazingly rewarding. So I guess a big part of being a success if you're in the clinical area is the sense you're making a difference to somebody's life. I don't think academics get that quite so much. Sometimes we may get a sense of that with teaching. So sometimes you have a sense with teaching that, you've perhaps helped somebody in terms of them understanding something or thinking about things. I can imagine if you're a clinical psychologist and you have a sense that you do impact other people's lives, that must be amazingly rewarding. And that must be a big element of that sense of success.
Do you think there's any way of kind of not solving, but relieving the pressures that are within the academic environment today?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, I think universities are, we're prisoners of a particular kind of model, really, because universities have become more like businesses. And so there's a big focus on income generation. And you see now universities paying attention to these rankings, you know, student satisfaction or research productivity or whatever it is. And I can understand where that has come from and why that's there. But at the same time, that really does create a wider environment that all academics inhabit, I think, where universities are going to be, in a sense, competing with each other, and they want their staff to be doing the research or getting the media headlines, whatever that allows their university to go up the rankings, to overtake others, things like that. So I think universities inhabit an environment now where their room for manoeuvre is pretty limited. We've gone for a sort of, you know, a business. Universities have become businesses in a way that, say, 30, 40 years ago, they weren't.
Yeah.
So the climate has certainly changed.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of kind of, I mean, myself as a fourth year as well, but others as well, how that kind of, I mean, what's going to happen in a few years, but also how is that going to, how are we going to fit in within that environment without coming down with like chronic stress or, you know, different mental issues, I guess you could say. It's,
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean,
it's scary to think about.
certainly if you talk to any academic, they'll talk about workload, the pressure of workload. And I think that workload objectively has increased over the period that I've been an academic. Of course, all academics, when you start out, the first few years are just a nightmare, because you have this idea that, oh, I'll be able to do some research, and then you've got this teaching, and then you have this administration, and then you have this, and you have this. So I think the experience, certainly for every single academic I've ever known in their first 3 or 4 years, was they look back at that with a sense of horror. How the hell did I survive that? And to some degree, as I've said, because of the pressures on universities, the climate we're in, those pressures never really go away. And I think the other thing about being an academic is, you know, you write your paper that you're really pleased with, you send it off to a journal. This is, you know, 4 years of my life has gone into this. And then they send it back with a rejection. We're not going to publish this. Or they say, well, there's something here that's quite interesting, but really you need to radically rewrite this. So you get a lot of negative feedback as an academic. And that's part and parcel of the territory. You know, you write a piece of work making certain claims, theoretical claims, empirical claims, and then other people critique your work. And, you know, that's part and parcel of the discipline. It's meant to be challenging and critiqued and taken apart. But sometimes when you're having your stuff taken apart, you do feel it very, very personally. And it's, you know, it can be pretty upsetting, and really does knock your self-confidence. So
Yeah.
somehow you need to just get up and carry on, which is hard.
Yeah. I guess academics have good stress management sometimes, or at least have to develop it.
Well, that is a challenge, I think, that we all have. So, you know, I think we all get stressed, and, you know, the information overload, trying to keep up with the literature, trying to keep up with your email, trying to keep up with marking, whatever. So there's an awful lot there. Do we manage the stress well? I guess most of the time we kind of somehow manage to keep it together, but occasionally it all blows up. So
yeah, that's fair.
it all hits the fan.
I also have some other questions that are quite interesting. Someone asked what your thoughts are on the military.
On the military?
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. I don't know.
I guess it's the idea of the kind of the group identity that kind of builds up in the military.
That's interesting. Okay. I've never done research on the military. So I've not really got any first-hand experience. I mean, I guess the military is an interesting context to do psychological research, because I guess, a big part of military training is about developing a strong sense of community, group identity. If you think about them marching around on the parade ground, that's not because that is intrinsically a good thing to do. It's a vehicle to create a body of people, typically men, not always, a body of people who feel connected with each other, who trust each other, who will go the extra mile for each other. So I guess doing research in the military will be an interesting context to look at group formation and of how that sense of community can be very strong. For sure, we know that when people leave the military, very often their experiences aren't great. In part, that's because they will have witnessed things and been involved in acts that are dehumanizing, that are deeply, so they'll suffer from PTSD. So that may be one reason why they have negative experiences on leaving the military. But I think the other thing is that they are part of a community that when you leave the military, you suddenly realize is no longer there. So
did you find that with your research on police, did you find any that you mentioned you did interviews with them during your PhD, I think it was. Did you find any interesting, like, how their group identity, did that kind of carry in the same way of them kind of, I guess, if they were to leave, then a part of them would be missing, I guess you could say?
To be honest, the research didn't really directly address that. And this was just after my PhD. So my PhD was all about group processes and how we're influenced by others. The project with the police was looking at young people and the police and tensions between young people and the police. And this was going way back. I started this job in 1987. Just for 2 years, and I did it in Bristol, and Bristol had had a period of real tension between young people and the police, particularly young black people and the police. There'd been the St. Paul's riots in Bristol, and the police there were trying to improve relations with young people, and they were essentially going into school and trying to build up relationships with people in a school context. So it was away from the charged atmosphere of the street, as it were. And we did a questionnaire survey that was quite interesting, a big survey looking at young people's attitudes towards the police. And then the bit that I really enjoyed that I did was doing interviews with young people about their understandings of their contacts with the police, and then doing interviews with the police about their understandings of young people. And so my interviews with the police there were focused very much on their understandings of society as a whole, of where they thought the police stood in society, their relationship with the black community, their relationship with young people. I was looking, I guess, at their representations of the world, their role, their responsibility. I was looking at issues around prejudice, discrimination. So for me, that was just very, very exciting as a project, but I didn't really address the sort of questions that you're looking at. It was kind of interesting because that project was funded by the Home Office, and they have responsibility for policing. And so the police sometimes, when they heard the Home Office, thought I was from the Home Office. And of course, I just finished my PhD, so I was, an academic in training, as it were. So it was quite interesting that they would sometimes think that I was from the Home Office. And then, of course, whenever I was interviewing young people, they thought I was from the police. So I had to make it very clear that I wasn't from the police. So it was an interesting project. And that was my first engagement, as I say, with qualitative data. It could well be interesting to do things with the military. I've never thought of doing it.
I guess this is a bit going away from the question, but do you think a project like that with the police and young people, especially with the black community, do you think that the answers they gave back then would be similar to, for example, today with, Black Lives Matter and the protest over the summer? Do you think it would be similar, the views that they had back then and today?
Well, that's a very good question. The interviews that I did with young people then, and this is going back 1987 through to 1989, I worked on that project. The themes there were very much bound up with the power of the police for stop and search, the way in which young people were seen as being a problem, young black males in particular had that real sense that they were singled out for special attention. It wasn't only young black males. There was quite a broad sense, I guess, that the police were not to be trusted, that you couldn't rely upon them. But that was most acutely felt, I think, by some of our young black participants. And of course, there was a whole history that they could point to, a whole set of experiences that they had had or that they had heard through family members, things like that. I suspect that that hasn't changed that much. I suspect, it's interesting, that research was done in Bristol, and of course it was in Bristol during the summer that the statue of the slave trader, I've forgotten his name now, was pulled down and was thrown into the harbour there. So I think Black Lives Matter had a real strong presence in Bristol, and I think that reflects a continuation of what I was seeing when I was doing that research in the mid-1980s. In terms of the attitudes that the police have, I suspect that the attitudes that the police have changed in various ways. For sure, there was an awareness way back then that there is a big issue about the relationship between the police and black people. And I think with some variation, the tendency was to blame black people for not really recognising the proper role of the police. Now I hope that that would have changed somewhat.
Yeah.
But I think, to change a culture is pretty hard. And I think the police culture has changed in various ways, but I think there's still massive, massive issues that need to be addressed within
Definitely.
society more generally as well.
Yeah, I guess it is hard to change, especially when I guess like the kind of role that the police has and the companionship I guess they have within that group or within their department, because I mean with any work environment you get very close to them, especially with the police it is sometimes very dangerous.
Yeah.
So I guess it's very hard to change that kind of attitude in a workplace.
I mean, I think group cultures are properties of the group as a whole, not necessarily of the individuals within them. And that, a group culture can be transmitted kind of generationally. It's nothing to do with which particular individuals are in the group. It's something about the group culture as a whole. Having said all of that, I think there have been significant changes. So, for example, if you look at the area of how police take the issue of violence against women, I think that has changed quite a lot. So, 30, 40 years ago, I think the understanding of violence against women, of sexual assault, of what we call domestic violence was pretty, very, very outdated and shocking in all sorts of ways. But I think certainly that has changed, or steps are going in the right direction. Of course, it's never fast enough and it's never as it should be. So for sure, there's still work to be done there.
Definitely. Just as a last kind of question I want to ask, do you have any I know lecturers are struggling a lot with online teaching and it's definitely not optimal. Do you have any advice for students this year with COVID and online teaching and kind of keeping their mental health and themselves healthy?
Well, that's a very good question. For sure, it's hard spending a lot of your life stuck in front of a screen. It's even harder when you're in your bedroom. So you sleep in that room, you probably eat in that room, and there you are stuck in a screen in front of that room. In that room. So for sure, it's not good that perhaps 18 hours, 20 hours a day you are in one room. It is a bit like being in a prison cell. So for sure, that's bad. Getting out, I think, is the key thing, and getting exercise, things like that, obviously. So just trying to get out and get exercise. In terms of the online, I don't quite know how students experience the whole online learning process. I think it can give people an opportunity to ask questions, and staff love it when students ask questions. It's incredibly hard doing online teaching when you're just looking at a PowerPoint screen in your room thinking, are there people out there? Are they listening? Are they engaged? Whatever. So it is wonderful when you get questions in the chat box. It's wonderful when people follow up later on asking things. So I guess it's hard to really engage with material in some situations, but if you make the effort to engage, then I think that has to be for the best. It's a very tough environment. Trying to get out of your kind of the confines of your room or your bedsit or flat or whatever, I think is probably the most important thing. Trying to keep connections with other students, I think, would be a big thing. One of the nice things about going to a lecture, obviously you get to have the lecture, but you get to be with people and you get to sit next to somebody and have a chat and then perhaps go for a coffee afterwards. So it's that sort of informal, everyday contact with a broader community. And I think it's also useful because you can check how you're feeling about something with somebody else. So if you're sitting there in your room thinking, good God, I don't understand what the hell Nick Hopkins is going about here. It must be me, I must be stupid. But then if you're able and you're sitting next to somebody in a lecture theatre and you whisper to them, can you understand this? And they say, no, not a word. Then at least you have a sense of, well, it's not just me, it's him. So I think that everyday interaction that you have with others is important for all sorts of reasons. And for students, I think one thing that it helps you triangulate or benchmark how you're doing in relation to your peers. It also allows you to have some sense of, can I ask them for some advice? One of the nice things we used to have in psychology over many years is we have the reading room, that you would see groups of students there who would be working and then they'd be chatting, explaining things to each other. I think we've lost that element of the learning environment, which is a shame. So anything that students can do to set up little networks where they're able to help each other, even if it's just informal advice, then I think that makes a big difference. It's quite reassuring. Otherwise, you're quite isolated, wondering, am I the only one who doesn't understand this? Which isn't not a good place to be.
I guess just as a little promotion here, I can mention that DUPS is doing the mentoring scheme and academic families. So if
perfect
for everyone, please check your emails because we have written quite a lot of emails about it and we haven't gotten all responses. And we really want to get started with it. But of course, with the mentoring, you can't have just one person doing it. You need two people to work together.
Yeah.
So yeah, everyone, make sure to check your emails, please.
That sounds a great initiative, because I think it's the thing that you don't really notice you've not got until you've not got it.
No, definitely. It's the small little comments and conversations that make a huge difference.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for doing this, Nick. This was really interesting, and I'll put this up probably tomorrow. So I think all lecturers and students should be able to see it on Blackboard.
Oh my God. Okay, well, thanks very much. I've never been interviewed before, so that was a lovely opportunity. Thanks very much.